Some messages appear only once, not because time is running out, but because the psyche does not repeat itself after recognition. This is not appearing because something is about to begin. It appears because something has already ended. You are not being invited into a moment, persuaded toward a decision, or positioned at a threshold. What you are encountering is residue. What remains after a structure has already completed its work. This doesn't arrive to change you. It arrives because change no longer needs to announce itself. There is no instruction here, no promise embedded beneath the words, no requirement to act or respond. The message exists briefly because consciousness has brushed against something that no longer requires reinforcement. Once that contact occurs, repetition becomes unnecessary. You will not see this again in the same way. Not because it disappears, but because once recognition happens, the psyche moves on. Jung observed that the most significant psychological reorganizations complete themselves before consciousness can name what has ended. Energy withdraws first, form collapses later. Identity does not dissolve through conflict or dramatic rupture, but through silence, through something that simply stops responding. Completion is rarely marked by clarity or relief. It is marked by absence. Jung captured this with precision when he wrote, "The decisive moment is when the pain of remaining the same becomes greater than the pain of change." This decisive moment does not feel like courage, resolution, or breakthrough. It feels like indifference where effort once lived. What we call the death of the old self is not destruction. It is the psyche no longer maintaining a structure that has finished its task.
Nothing is torn away. Nothing is conquered.
Something simply no longer answers when called. From here, experience shifts not through insight, but through lived quiet, where understanding follows behind what has already reorganized itself without spectacle or announcement. When identity stops responding, nothing dramatic announces itself. Life continues with familiar surfaces intact, but the internal reflexes that once rushed forward simply do not engage. Situations arise that would have previously triggered defense, explanation, or emotional contraction. Yet, the response never fully arrives. There is no collapse, no withdrawal, no sense of breaking apart. There is also no urgency to repair, interpret, or protect. Problems still occur.
Conversations still unfold. Pressures still exist.
But they no longer register as verdicts against the self. The experience is subtle enough to be missed yet unmistakable once noticed. What has changed is not circumstance but position. Previously the ego lived inside every conflict, treating each friction as a statement about identity, worth, or direction. Now the conflict happens nearby, adjacent to awareness without claiming ownership. This is often misread as detachment, dissociation, or emotional dulling. But it is none of these. Detachment implies distance created through effort. What is happening here requires no effort at all. It is structural separation. The psyche has quietly removed identity from the center of experience. Because emotional reward is absent, many assume something has gone wrong. They search for intensity, for meaning, for proof that they are still engaged with life. Neutrality feels suspicious in a culture trained to equate feeling with aliveness. But neutrality is not emptiness. It is stability without identity maintenance. The absence of defensiveness does not indicate passivity. It indicates that nothing internal is being threatened. Reactions may still appear, but they pass through without rooting themselves in a story about who you are. Decisions are made without self-justification. Boundaries occur without explanation. Even moments of discomfort arise cleanly, then dissolve without spiraling into self-referential loops.
This is why the shift feels quiet rather than triumphant.
There is no new identity stepping forward to replace the old one. There is simply a lack of response where performance once lived. When life stops feeling personal, it is not because you have disengaged from experience, but because the psyche no longer needs a self to defend, and nothing further is required from consciousness itself. As the self no longer needs defending, pressure loses its authority. What once pushed, tightened, or compelled action no longer finds resistance to work against. Pressure once had a job. It organized movement when internal structure was unstable. It created urgency where clarity was missing and force where coherence had not yet formed. Now that same pressure feels oddly misplaced, even disruptive. Action still happens, but it no longer arrives through anxiety. Decisions occur without internal threat. Movement unfolds without the sense that something terrible will happen if you stop. This is not because life has become easier, but because force is no longer required to hold the psyche together. Psychologically, pressure is a compensatory mechanism. It substitutes intensity for structure. When identity was fragile, pressure kept things moving by creating fear of collapse, fear of stagnation, fear of falling behind. It produced coherence through tension. But once structure exists, pressure interferes. It begins to feel intrusive, like noise in a system that no longer needs stimulation to function.
This is where misunderstanding arises.
Stillness is quickly labeled stagnation. Calm is mistaken for loss of ambition. Without visible striving, others assume something essential has disappeared. Internally, the misinterpretation can be even stronger. The absence of pressure feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious because effort once served as proof of progress. But effort was never the proof. It was the workhound. What is happening here is not a slowing down. It is the end of fleeing. When nothing internal is chasing you forward, movement becomes cleaner. You act because action is appropriate, not because rest feels dangerous.
You stop without guilt.
You begin without forcing momentum. Even pauses feel intact rather than empty. The psyche no longer relies on pressure to generate direction because direction is no longer under threat. This is why attempts to reintroduce urgency feel artificial. Pressure no longer organizes anything. It agitates. The system has already stabilized. What once motivated now distracts. This phase often passes quietly without external markers because nothing needs to be proven. There is no tension to resolve and no intensity to sustain. When pressure stops working, it is because the inner chaos that required it has already resolved. As pressure fades into irrelevance, what remains is a silence that does not announce itself. This is where the old self settles, not through disappearance, but through loss of conviction. You can still remember who you were, recall the preferences, ambitions and reflexes that once organized your days, but you cannot convincingly perform them anymore. Self-explanation weakens. Narration collapses mid-sentence. The urge to define yourself loses momentum before it finishes forming. Old ambitions feel strangely theatrical, like lines delivered after the audience has already left. Nothing dramatic replaces them. There is no crisis, no inner battle, no mourning period that demands attention. The psyche simply stops investing energy in a structure that no longer serves movement. Psychologically, this is expected. Survival identities dissolve before new structures appear. The mind does not immediately rebuild what it has outgrown.
It clears space first.
Silence is preferred over false continuity. Where the old self once spoke reflexively, filling gaps with explanation and intent, there is now restraint. This restraint is often misread as emptiness or loss, but it is neither. It is suspension. Jung understood the persona as a tool, not a permanent structure. It exists to facilitate adaptation, to protect movement through the world. When it no longer performs that function, it collapses quietly. There is no confrontation because none is needed. The persona loses authority rather than being defeated. You may notice this in small ways. You stop correcting misunderstandings that once felt urgent.
You abandon justifications halfway through.
You notice yourself acting without needing to explain why. The old self is still accessible in memory, but it no longer organizes behavior. This is what psychological death actually looks like. Not erasure, but irrelevance. Not destruction, but completion. The structure remains visible, but unused. It feels ordinary, almost boring, which is why it goes unnoticed. Yet this ordinariness signals stability because what once required effort, tension, and repetition now holds itself without supervision or defense from consciousness or explanation by the mind any longer here. The old self doesn't end in conflict. It ends when it no longer needs to speak. As the old self settles into quiet irrelevance, a final shift emerges.
Interventionsisis.
You no longer feel the need to fix, justify, or engineer yourself. And not because you have failed or given up, but because effort is no longer required. Awareness replaces correction.
Where onze impulses demandis chapping, you now observe them calmly, letting sensations, thoughts, and emotions register without manipulation.
Insight arrives spontaneously without explanation, without argument, without rehearsal. Small impulses, recurring thoughts, and subtle anxieties continue to appear, but they no longer
Compel acción.
Observation itself suffices. Psychologically, this is precise. The act of fixing belongs to unresolved conflict. Once conflict resolves structurally, intervention becomes unnecessary. What remains is perception unburdened by compulsion. The psyche no longer demands that consciousness act to maintain coherence because the internal architecture is stable.
This is why calm can feel unfamiliar.
It is the absence of survival mechanics rather than a sign of passivity. Jung implicitly described this phenomenon in The Expansion of Consciousness. When resistance relaxes, awareness itself grows free from the constraints that once dictated behavior. The mind is no longer outrunning tension, guilt, or incomplete narratives. Instead, it registers life directly with clarity that does not need reinforcement. Everyday experiences continue to occur, yet their arrival does not provoke reflexive interference. Life unfolds and is noticed without manipulation. Small decisions, sensations, and interactions are received fully without automatic rectification. This is not growth as commonly imagined because it does not announce itself. It is confirmation in structural form, not progress in narrative. Anchor this awareness. When attention replaces self-intervention, the psyche has exited survival. The cessation of effort, the surrender of correction is not weakness or passivity. It is the final internal acknowledgement that the old mechanisms are no longer needed, that the system functions independently, and that consciousness can remain present without compulsion, without defense, without obligation. This quiet non-intervention is the final signal before integration. The unspoken testimony of completion. After the psyche stops demanding intervention, a subtle settling begins.
Stillness pervades experience.
Bodily presence anchors consciousness and there is no need to act, fix, or interpret. Non-inference becomes the default. Psychological death, the quiet dissolution of the old self, is followed not by immediate transformation, but by stabilization. The structures that once required constant attention now function without effort. Awareness can simply observe without coercion or management. Small sensations, passing thoughts, and interactions continue, but they no longer demand orchestration. The mind rests in its own clarity. There is no urgency, no narrative, no need for confirmation. Completion is evident not in drama but in the quiet capacity to remain intact. Anchor this insight. What has reorganized does not need to announce itself. Life continues, but the mechanisms of survival are no longer operative. The psyche has moved on and with it the old self has finished its work. This moment requires only observation, not action. The final reflection arrives naturally. This is seen once because it marks completion, not beginning. The old self no longer responds, and the structures that supported it have dissolved quietly, leaving space for presence without compulsion.
A reflective question demands.
If you're no longer fighting who you were, what happens if you stop trying to become someone new right away? The answer cannot be prescribed. It must be witnessed. This is Echoes of Psyche, where awareness quietly meets the unseen structures of the mind and heart.